Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah. Okay, now tonight we're going to be doing some looking at some things that maybe you hadn't even thought about, or if you looked at it, with a certain kind of teaching that maybe you didn't. I know I did. So I'm going to admit right at the very beginning that I learned something in studying for this thing tonight. Of course, that's not unusual. Seems like I learned something just about every week when I try to put this thing together. 1 Corinthians 7:1-2. And now concerning the things about which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, but because of much immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Now, here's the thing that I learned something on, or just I had really never thought about it, to tell you the truth. This letter here that Paul is writing in 1 Corinthians, of course, it's the second letter that he had written to them. The first one is lost. So evidently there was a letter, and then they wrote to him, and now he's writing back. And so this letter is in response to what they had written to him, plus a few things that people had told him, that were going on in the congregation. And so, last week there were things that the Corinthians were saying, and then Paul said them as if it were him saying it. The Greek didn't translate really well to the English, where last week we talked about I am free to do all things. Well, that's not Paul saying that. He was referring back to what the Corinthians were saying, their attitude, their meme, as it were, that they could do all things. They had freedom in Yeshua. So now we get another one here, where it says, now concerning things which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Well, now I can agree with that. Certainly, if it's not your wife, don't touch her, guys. Okay, you can get in trouble. And so I thought Paul was, saying, okay, let's do away with anything with women, and make sure that you don't. What they're saying is that don't touch a woman means don't have marital or sexual relations with a woman. All right, certainly. And he's talking within the idea of marriage here. Don't have marital relations with your wife. And I thought, I'd read it, but it just never did click with me as what Paul was saying, because I just rejected it anyway. See, and I thought, well, he's saying something I don't understand, so I'm just going to, I'll go on to something else. But he says, because of much immorality, let each man have his own wife, and each woman have her own husband. Well, they had already been talking about the idea of certain immoral things going on within the congregation there in Corinth. And so Paul is saying here, you wonder why you've got an immorality problem and guys going to prostitutes and stuff, when you guys are saying, it's the Corinthians that are saying it's not good for a man to touch a woman. Well, evidently in the church there, the congregation there in Corinth, somehow they had gotten the point to their point in their spirituality that, and those are air quotes in case you're not watching this, their spirituality, that some had concluded that married couples should forego marital relationships, marital relations. In other words, you don't go to bed with your wife. And in their mind, that made them more pure and holy and spiritual and that sort of thing. Um, Paul was only repeating their mantra. He was not stating it as a preference or as a commandment or a suggestion. Okay, quite the opposite. So my opinion of Paul has taken a real step up. All right, because I thought he was making some kind of a wackadoodle statement there about not touching a woman, and meaning that not your wife. So he quickly disabused him of their error. And just remember that abstinence makes the heart go wander. All right. And that's what Paul is saying there, that because of such or much immorality, let each man have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Then that way you won't go wandering off the reservation, as it were. Okay. So, is anyone confused about that right now as to what Paul was saying there? He was using their phrase and something that was going on within that congregation uh, to evidently it was just to increase their spirituality and their uh, what comes to mind is a group of people who during first century, they were called the Essenes in Israel, and the Essenes were very ascetic people, and they decided that, well, it's we're at the end times, and so just to be holy and such, then we are not going to have. We're not going to allow sexual relations within our congregation. Well, guess what? That movement died out after one generation. Wonder why? And so, at any rate, there was actually a group of people in Israel at the time called the Essenes, and that was one of their things is no sex. All right, so probably not a very fun organization to be in. All right, First Corinthians 7:3-6. Let the husband fulfill his obligation to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have the rights to her own body, but the husband. Likewise also the husband does not have the rights to his own body, but the wife. Do not deprive one another except by mutual consent for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan doesn't tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But this I say as a concession, not as a command. Okay. So Paul here, he's telling you marriage has obligations. There are certain things that are expected of married people, besides, arguing from time to time. One of those is that you're supposed to have sexual relations between the husband and wife. Okay, that goes without saying, but evidently we had to say it because the Corinthian people had decided that, oh no, we're going to be holier than that. Well, anyway, Paul is going back and says, no, you have obligations, and not fulfilling those obligations on either part is not acceptable. Now, neither the husband nor the wife has absolute command of each other, nor do they actually have absolute veto over each other. It's a mutual covenant. Okay, you have to agree to those things. And this is not a marriage counseling class, so we're not going to get into into the nitty-gritty of it, but that's the way God made us. Okay, when you get married, that's what's expected. I think everybody in this I'm just looking through here. Yep, I think everybody in this class tonight is married or has been married or at one point or another. So you know what I'm talking about. So Paul allowed abstinence or deprivation from each other only for a temporary time, for maybe a special prayer time or prayer and fasting or something, but it was only temporary, not something that was going to go on and on and on, because it's just not a good thing to do. Even God looked down from his window in the sky and he said, it's not good for Adam to be alone, and so that's why he made Eve. So that goes back a long, long way. It's not good for a man and his wife to be apart. Any comment? Go, and jump in there if you got any comments or questions here. So we'll
no, just that my husband said the Shakers tried that.
Yeah. That's right. I remember now. Yeah, the Shakers tried that back in the early part of our own. I think they were here in the United States as well as in Europe, and yeah, that movement didn't last a long time either. So yeah, it just doesn't work out very, very well, not very popular, not very practical. So, but Paul goes on and he says, yet I wish that all men were like me. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this way and another that. But I say to the unmarried and to widows, it is good for them to remain as I am. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry. For it's better to marry than to burn with desire. All right, now, let me ask a question. Was Paul married? Do we know if Paul was married or not? And I don't know. I looked all around it, and I could never find anything definitive that said Paul was married. He talked about the thorn in the flesh, but I don't think he was talking about a wife. All right, so we don't know whether he was married or not. Now, some think that certainly at the time that he was writing this letter to the Corinthians, he was not married, because he was talking to these people about staying unmarried as even I am unmarried. And so, but he also, he had no problem with the apostles and so forth being married, because in we'll see later on in a couple of more chapters, Paul says, don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? And so evidently the other apostles, including Yeshua's brothers and Peter, all they brought their wives with them on their missionary journeys. So if Paul was married at one time, when we don't know, his wife had likely passed away, considering that he never mentions her in any of his writings. And Paul declared here in verse 7, and we'll get to it in a minute, that he had this. Well, we just read it. It's not real clear. It doesn't stick out at you. That he had the gift of celibacy. I wish that all men were like me. However, each man has his own gift from God. And so you get from that he was not married, he was celibate, and so it would be good for other men to be that way. But I say to you, the unmarried and to widows, it is good for them to remain as I am, and so forth. So let's see what does that really say? When Paul, his statement to the widows, to the unmarried and the widows in the Corinth church, that pretty well proves to me that he was not married at the time. And so we don't know whether he got married later on. There's really nothing in the Bible that tells us that. Now, they say that Paul would have been married at one point because he was a member of the Sanhedrin and was required to be married. However, we have no evidence that Paul was ever in or was a member of the Sanhedrin. He was close. He was part of that inner circle in the synagogue and in that in the administration of the synagogue before his Damascus Road experience. But and he talked about it in Galatians, first chapter of Galatians, where he said, even I was even advancing within Judaism beyond anyone my age group. He said I was a prodigy, basically, and I was more extremely observant than any of the other guys around, is basically what he was telling them. So he was well on his way, and but we never know whether he was fully ensconced in the Sanhedrin. So was he married? We don't know, and it's it's just not really possible to come up with a definitive answer on that. So Paul considered his celibacy as a gift from God, that every person had a different gift. And so he recommended it several times. You'll see in this chapter, he recommended that people that were not married should remain not married. But he said, if you don't have self-control with regards to marriage, then you should marry. And then it talks there about, let's get the right verse here, where he says, for it's better to marry than to burn with desire. Okay, the idea of the burn is a word that was used back in Greek literary usage, that basically is passion, and it was or lust. Passion if you're going to get married, lust if you're just going to be a lecher. Okay, so that's what the word was. That's what he's telling us there. Okay, let's go ahead then. No comments or questions so far. All right. But to the married I command, not I, but the Lord. So this is Paul saying, not anything that he got from the Lord. A wife is not to be separated from her. No, said go back again. But to the married I command, not I, but the Lord. So he's saying, okay, even though I'm saying it, it's also God is saying it. The Lord is saying this. A wife is not to be separated from her husband. But if she gets separated, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband is not to divorce his wife. But to the rest I say, I, not the Lord. Now here's where he deviates from that. He said, if any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she agrees to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if any woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he agrees to live with her, she must not divorce him. Now, all of the commentary that we see, any of the commentary that we see from Paul, should be viewed in the window of their original premise. What was that in verse 2? Was that a man should not have relations with a woman. Okay, so everything that Paul is saying here is going against or with that one statement or that one premise, and everything that he talks about is revolving around that a man's spiritual situation should not change in his should not require a man's spiritual situation should not require a change in his physical situation. All right, so Paul is really pushing here hard for the status quo. Remain as you are. Marriage is supposed to be a forever thing. If a person is married to a non-believer, then they should stay married so long as the non-believer wishes to continue. Because he's saying you just stay with each other until you die. That's the plan. That's what's supposed to be. That you're not supposed to, and evidently what was going on in this Corinthian church was that people were saying, well, if you're married to an unbeliever, then how can you be spiritual enough for the rest of us? You need to divorce yourself from this unbelieving spouse so that you can be spiritual like the rest of us. And, everybody polish up your halo and go, ah. And so that's what looked like what they were doing there. And so Paul is jumping against that, going back up against that. And so he says, for the unbelieving husband is made holy through the wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever separates, let him be separated. The brother or sister is not bound. The brother or sister is not bound in such cases, but God has called you to shalom. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? How do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Now, okay, so what does this mean? The idea that when he's saying that the unbelieving husband is made holy through the wife. So if you're a believer and your spouse is not a believer, then does that make your spouse redeemed or saved, or does that make them a believer? Anybody say yes? Jump on there so I can quickly jump back on you. Obviously not. I mean, there's only salvation is a personal thing. You cannot get your spouse. You cannot get saved for your spouse. Your salvation does not bring your spouse along. It doesn't bring your children along. And so what is Paul saying here? The unbelieving husband is made holy through the wife. He's talking about the idea that if a believing spouse stays true to the word, then they are more than likely, or they're very much more likely to bring that unbelieving spouse to faith than if the unbeliever was not married to them, if they had no godly influence in them. So what Paul is talking about here is that as a believer, your influence has a godly effect, has a sanctifying effect on your spouse. Will it come? And he says, for you, wife, you know whether you're going to save your husband? No, you don't. But if you are divorced and you're separated away, the likelihood of that unbelieving spouse coming to faith is greatly reduced at this point. So, so Paul is saying there, if you are married to an unbeliever, stay married to the unbeliever. Status quo. Don't change for the cause of your religion and so forth, or your spirituality, because you may be putting into that situation the very thing that your spouse needs to come to faith. Okay, it's a very serious thing. It says, and God has called you to shalom, meaning that whatever you can do to be at peace with your spouse in marriage. Now they said if they want to divorce, then okay, you're allowed the divorce if your unbelieving spouse wants it, but do it in peace, do it in shalom. And so what that really means, if you read the various commentators, they don't really have agreement with that as to what that you are called to shalom, what that really means. But I think Paul is saying, and no matter what it is that you do here, let's be peaceful about it, and we don't want to be like I always think of. I can't even think of her name now, but the taming of the shrew. That kind of a person. Don't be that kind of a person. And he's also talking about your children. They would be unclean, but now they are holy. So it comes that now that kind of gets us into normative Judaism. That statement right there is a little bit more toward the normative Judaism, is that, if say for instance, if the mother is Jewish, then the children are Jewish. All right. And even so, even if the father is Jewish, depending, unless you're really heavily Orthodox, then the children are Jewish. But he's saying here that that the children would be unclean; they would be outside the body of Messiah. But for the believing spouse, the believing parent, then the children are in kind of a special category that God would put them in, because they've got a believing father or mother. And so the idea again that child or that unbelieving spouse would come to faith is a lot more likely if the believing spouse, the believing parent, stays the course and continues on in the marriage. That's why Paul goes over and over and over again about don't change, don't jump ship in your marriage, in your relationship. Stay with it. All right. Did I lose anybody on the way? You got any comments or questions on that? All right. So then let's go ahead.
I have a question.
Okay.
So I have a friend. He said the believing wife, if he's married to an unbeliever, should not leave the unbeliever if he wants to stay, right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so what if the unbeliever wants to stay but is abusive?
Okay, Paul does not address every hypothetical question that is out there. He couldn't. I was thinking the same thing about that. Well, what do you do? Well, I think again, if I can say it like Paul did, this is me and not specifically from the Lord, that a believing spouse would not necessarily have to stay with an abusive spouse, especially if there's danger to the spouse or to the children. That to me, what that does, that unbelieving spouse, if he's abusive, if she's abusive, they have violated the covenant of marriage. Okay, it's almost like they have committed adultery, but not really, but they have violated what they said in their marriage vows of loving, honoring, and all of that kind of stuff. And so I think that if a man or a woman is abusive to their spouse, and sometimes women are abusive to their spouses too. It doesn't have to be just a man. I can remember back many years ago when I was captain of a ship, we had a guy that came in one day to the ship, and he was beat to a bloody pulp, and his wife had taken a baseball bat to him when he was asleep, and she just had it in her mind that he was cheating on her because he didn't come home at night. Well, he didn't come home at night because he had the duty on the ship. And so she was really wackadoodle. So eventually, I think they had to split. But a wife can be abusive too. So normally it is the husband, but a wife can be abusive, and I don't believe that God would expect us to stay in a situation where our life or the lives of our children are in danger. And that. Can I quote you line and verse on that in the Bible that says you can do that? No, I can't. I'm just that's just, to me, that seems what is practical.
Okay, thank you. Yes,
ma'am. All right. Any other comments or questions? Anybody disagree with that assessment that I just had? Please speak up. All right. So let's go ahead in verse 17. only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, let him walk in this way. I give this rule in all of Messiah's communities. Was anyone called when he already had been circumcised? Let him not make himself uncircumcised. Has anyone been called while uncircumcised? Let him not allow himself to be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and circumcision and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping God's commandments matters. All right. So here Paul goes into, he kind of shifts the argument. And it's still talking about status here, but he's no longer talking about husband and wife per se. He's talking about another kind of status report here. He said, only as the Lord has assigned to each of you, as God has called each, let him walk in this way. In other words, were you were you, and he says also, he says, I give this rule in all of Messiah's communities. So this is like the second time. He actually does it 4 times in Corinthians, that tells about, he says, hey, I tell all the other congregations the same thing. You're no different. I'm telling them the same thing. And so what Paul does here, he says that each one of us is called to what? Well, some people are born into Jewish families. Some people are born into Gentile families. And so that's where he's talking about here. Was anyone called when he was already been circumcised? I mean, was he a Jew when he came to faith in Yeshua? And he says, let not himself or make himself uncircumcised. Okay. Now, for all of you who think that is a thing that, or it's an impossible thing, think again. Back in the day, in that era, the Jews who had been Hellenized, basically they'd kind of gotten away from the covenant and from Judaism, and they wanted to participate in the activities of the Greeks, mainly sporting events and the gymnasium and getting big muscles and running and wrestling and all that kind of stuff. Well, they couldn't do that if they were circumcised, because the Greeks had this thing about the human body. And so when if a man was circumcised, then they looked at that as, okay, you're not a complete man. You're not in fact, you're just downright ugly, because you cut part of your body off, and so you're not whole, you're not complete, and so they could not participate in the gymnasium, as it were. And there was actually a procedure. It was not painless. In fact, it was very painful. It was semi-dangerous because of infection and so forth. But there was a procedure whereby men who had been circumcised could undergo the knife and bring things back down to where they appeared to be circumcised. All right. So that's what Paul is saying here. Is if you were a Jew, then don't make yourself uncircumcised. Don't mess with your body, as it were. And he says, has anyone been called while uncircumcised? In other words, were you a Gentile when you came to faith in Yeshua? Then don't allow anyone to himself to be circumcised. Now, circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is also nothing, but keeping God's commandments is what matters. All right, now this is this is actually the first time, I think, that Paul makes this radical statement about circumcision being nothing. Because, I mean, what Jew would go around saying, well, even being circumcised or uncircumcised, meh, it doesn't make any difference. yeah, it makes a big difference to the Jew, because if you're not circumcised, you are not part of the covenant. And so Paul, to make this kind of statement now, it doesn't matter to God whether you're circumcised or uncircumcised. That is a paradigm shift. Okay, that's a wave maker, as it were, that Paul would make that kind of a statement, because he goes on in other books and other to other congregations to reiterate this idea that there is no difference between a Jew and a Gentile in God's eyes. We're all the same. We all bleed red blood. Okay. And so, but that's what Paul is, again, going back in the Corinthian congregation. It was not a big deal, because that whole concept of whether you're circumcised or not circumcised, to the Corinthians, that was not an issue for them. In Galatia, it was a big deal, a big issue. And so Paul fought against that while he was out in Galatia many times. And so here, he's mentioning it as a case of the separation of Jew and Gentile. He said there is no separation. We are all one in God's eyes. All right. So, and the idea that circumcision makes no difference, because circumcision is not what saves a person. Okay. Minor surgery is not what is going to save a person. Okay. And so any comments or questions? All right. Going ahead. How are we ever going to finish? Okay. Verse 20, let each man remain in the calling in which he was called. Again, he's hitting that status quo. Were you called as a slave? Don't let that bother you. But if indeed you become free, make the most of the opportunity. For the one who was called in the Lord as a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, the one who was called while free is Messiah's slave. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. Excuse me just a second. Would you go take care of that dog barking? Okay. Had Pat's dog's making a fuss out there, something or another. But her dogs. Okay. See what I was telling you about marriage being a compromise? Her dogs. Okay. Were you a slave? Don't let that bother you. If you have the opportunity, make the most of it. For the one who is called in the Lord as a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, the one who is called while free is Messiah's slave. Paul called himself a slave of Messiah, a bond slave, many, many times. He says, you were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brothers and sisters, let each one, in whatever way he was called, remain that way in God. Okay. The calling here that he's talking about simply means your physical situation, your socioeconomic position, your geographic position, possibly, or whatever a person found himself in when he became a believer. It didn't mean that you couldn't change. He meant that, of course, certainly, he says, if you're a slave and you have the opportunity to become free, then go for it. Do it. But let me change. Okay. But the idea is that, okay, if you're a slave, make the most of it. You are now a free man in the eyes of God. You are no longer a slave to sin. And if you're a free man, then, okay, you're now, guess what? You're now a slave, or you are bonded to Yeshua. You are his servant. You're a servant of the Messiah. And he goes back to the imagery of the cross. He says, you were bought with a price, just like a slave is bought with a price. And he says, but don't become slaves of men. Now, and again, he's bringing back this idea of the status quo. Let each one of us, in whatever way he's called, remain that way in God. And I was been thinking about this thing. that, okay, so what changes would be allowed? And the only thing that I could think of is if a person was in an occupation that was, by its own definition, was a sinful occupation. Okay. And what comes to mind is prostitution. If a person is saved in the midst of their occupation as a prostitute, then certainly they need to make a change. Okay. If a person is a bank robber and he is saved, then yeah, he probably shouldn't be going around robbing any more banks. But that's I think that's kind of going outside of what Paul was talking about. It's each and every one of us. If we find ourselves in a situation where, okay, you're in a job, you're in a particular position somewhere within a job. It's not fair to eat snacks while somebody else is teaching. When you got a job at someplace and you get saved, you become a believer, then does that mean that forever you're going to be stuck on, as in that particular job? If you were on the bottom of the row of the rung of the totem pole there, and does God says, okay, no more promotions for you because now you're a believer, so you'll never get out of the mail room, or you'll never be promoted to this or that and the other, and you can't go up the ladder? No, they're not saying that. Paul says if you have a chance to become free, make the most of the opportunity. And so it doesn't preclude any of us from advancing up the ladder. But he's just, again, saying don't make a change just because you are now a believer. And other than what I was talking about, unless the job that you're holding, the position that you're holding, is by very definition an immoral position, then you must make a change. All right. Let's go ahead. Now concerning virgins. All right. So I have no command from the Lord, but I give an opinion as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think then, because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Don't seek a divorce. Are you free from a wife? Don't seek a wife. All right. So Paul seems like he's jumping from one side of the fence to the other. If you're married, well, make sure you stay married, and that you don't deprive your spouse of the sexual obligations and those kind of things. But at the same time, now he's saying, well, but if you're not married, then don't get married. Even though back earlier he said, yeah, if you're not married, but you can't have any self-control, and it's better to be married than to burn. And now he's talking about, okay, the virgins. Well, what are the virgins? They were a group within the unmarried people of Corinth, and Paul uses, out of the 6 times that he uses the word virgins here, he talks about they are feminine. He uses the feminine, a feminine gender in there. So he's pretty much talking about the women who are virgins in the congregation. Now, there were 3 major views about the identity of the virgins. And one is that they were the virgin daughters of men in the Corinth church, and that these fathers had questions about giving their daughters in marriage. Second view is that the virgins were both men and women who were living together in a spiritual, air quotes, marriage, i.e. without sexual relations. Yeah, right. And a third view is that the virgins were females who were engaged or thinking of becoming engaged, but were experiencing pressure from the spiritual people in the church to forego their marriage. Now, I believe that the text probably supports the latter view, that these were young ladies who were to be married or thinking about being married, something that, but people were saying, oh no, to be spiritual, you have to be chaste. You have to be, you have to be celibate. You cannot get married and have a husband, because then that would ruin you. Well, so Yeshua had not really, he had not really offered, address that particular problem as far as Paul knew. Now, he gave an inspired opinion here, as he was a trustworthy, wise steward of the Lord who had received mercy to be such. Okay, so Paul is saying, look, the Lord has blessed me with some wisdom and experience and so forth. So I'm telling you from basically my experience and just my walk with the Lord, what this should be. So that and he's saying this is kind of a suggestion, or is my opinion, but it's not a commandment from the Lord. So he was offering good advice, but not commanding everyone to do the same thing. And so he says those that that didn't follow his advice, they were not sinning. He just that he thought they were that they should be better. Okay, that they could do better than to get married. All right, now in verse 26, he talks about the idea of the present distress. All right, the present distress was, in Paul's view, was that the Messiah could return at any minute. I mean, his idea was that the Lord would come back any minute now, and you just never know. And so the idea was that if you, he was pushing this idea of the status quo. If you're not married, don't get married, because marriage and change, that takes energy and resources away from the mission of advancing the gospel in the pagan world. And that's what he said that they should be doing. All right. So verse 28, but if you marry, you have not sinned. If a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Yet such people will have, let me move my screen. I keep forgetting to do that. But this I say, brothers, and yet such people will have trouble in this fleshly life, and I'm trying to spare you. But this I say, brothers and sisters, the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should be as though they had none, and those who weep as though not weeping, and those who rejoice as though not rejoicing, and those who buy as those not possessing, and those who use the word world as though not using it to the fullest, for the present form of this world is passing away. Okay, not marrying, or marrying in this case is not sinful. Just Paul is saying, this is what I think, but if you want to get married, fine, do it. And same with the woman. If she wants to get married, fine, you haven't sinned. But the decision to marry could complicate their service to the Lord. Again, the idea that if you're married, it takes away some things that that you could be doing for the Lord. But and also though, I would take an adversarial point of view there, that sometimes when you get married, that if you've got the right spouse, and she can spur you on to greater heights than you never would have attained on your own. Okay, just saying, guys. And she's not even listening to me right now. So that's just one of the things I think that a good spouse can be a leverage. It can really be a force multiplier for you. And but Paul's talking about here, suppose a single woman gets into a position where an adversary may torture her for her faith. She could face that possibility more easily than a married woman who has children for whom she has responsibility could. So, a married woman is liable to do things for her children, to save her children, that she wouldn't have to make that decision if she was single. So that's possibly the kind of trouble that the present distress that Paul was talking about. Now, one of the things that's kind of happened here in this this particular text here is that this very pastoral concern that Paul expressed has been really a source of anxiety instead of comfort. So in Western cultures, we don't generally live in a time of present distress. There have been ups and downs within history, whereas present distress, but we don't get that sense of urgency that Paul did. And that's why he keeps pushing this idea of just hang on, guys, hang on, because the Lord is coming any minute now. And you don't want to be in a situation where you can't give him your very, very fullest. And so that's why Paul is really pushing this idea to the max. All right. So if I can get my cursor back over here. All right. So, and I didn't move that over. That's one thing about yeah, like I said there, Paul does everything and teaches everything on his eschatological output, which is the idea that the Lord is coming back any minute now. All right, going ahead, but I prefer you to be free from from cares. An unmarried man cares about things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord, but the married man cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. And he is divided. The unmarried woman, as well as the virgin, cares about the things of the Lord, so that she may be holy in body and in spirit. But the married woman cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Paul is just reiterating this whole idea that personal, believers that have personal attachments would hinder their ministry somewhat. They couldn't give it the full attention that an unmarried person could give. And so again, I'm not really sure that I agree 100% with Paul, because I do believe that with the right spouse, they are absolutely a force multiplier, and you can give Satan fits if you got the right woman. So now, 35. Now I say this for your own benefit, not to put a restraint on you, but to promote proper and constant service to the Lord without distraction. But if any man thinks he is behaving inappropriately toward his virgin, if the time is right and it's meant to be, let him do what he decides. He does not sin, let him marry. So here, Paul is just saying what we've already talked about. His position is based on practicalities of the day. He thought that things were just going south on him very quickly, and that the Lord was going to be coming, and so a person's attention should not be divided. So that's kind of where he's coming with that. But he says, look, if you get to that point and you think that you should be married, then go ahead and get married. It's okay. So let's go ahead there. So we're running out of time. But he who stands firm in his heart, who has no pressure, but has power over his own will, and so determined in his own heart to keep her a virgin, he will do well. So then both he who marries the virgin does well, and he who doesn't marry her does well. All right. So again, he's just stating it in a different way. There's no shame. There's no guilt. But you're going to break some little girl's heart, though. You've got to consider that. And I don't know that Paul considered that, but he did believe that being single was better because of his view of eschatology, the end time. The world is coming to an end. So a wife is bound to her husband for as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to anyone she wishes. He's just stating a fact at that point. Only in the Lord, though. If she remarries, make sure she remarries a believer. But in my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is. And I also think that I have the Ruach Elohim. So Paul's saying, I think I have the mind of the Spirit here in this, that people don't go out and make changes. Stay with the status quo, because the Lord is coming back right now, just imminent. Well, okay, so Paul didn't really... it was good. He had a good idea, but the Lord had delayed for whatever reason he wants to. God only knows, and so far he ain't telling. And so he's just holding off. And so Paul is at this point, that was the reason for his idea of not changing your status. Okay. So anyway, that ends up chapter 7 tonight. And let me open it up. Anybody got comments or questions?